Okay, so this is the second video for topic 5.2, the Atlantic Revolutions. And in this topic, we're focusing on two things: the internal and external factors, meaning the Enlightenment and nationalism, that led to the revolution in the first place, and how these states, after their revolution, adopted an enlightened government. So ultimately, this topic is about the causes and the effects of various revolutions. It is also about looking at the documents that drove these revolutions to evaluate the extent of their enlightenment. So ultimately, you need to be able to explain the role of the Enlightenment and nationalism in these revolutions. You also need to explain how effective they were. And you also need to be able to read these documents, understand the claim and the supporting evidence, to be able to compare them. So in this video, we're going to focus on the initial two Atlantic revolutions, the American and the French revolutions. And to help you organize your thoughts, I've provided you this chart where you're going to first of all write down the causes. The causes are going to be partially Enlightenment and partially nationalism. In this center column, you're going to write the key people and documents, and you're going to be very brief here. And then finally, the results and the effects. More than just people died. Ultimately, we want to know how enlightened these revolutions were. So we start off with the American Revolution. And we know by 1750, the American colonies were part of the British Mercantile Empire. And that because of mercantilism, they were required to supply wealth to the British in the form of gold and silver through the production of cash crops. Now, since they were in the Americas and surrounded by both Spanish and French possessions, they also required a great deal of commitment by the British to defend their possessions from those two nations. So they were very expensive. So when you look at the causes, being nationalism and being the Enlightenment, the first thing that we have to bring up is English mercantilism. The British had ruled the 13 colonies of America as a maritime empire. As you know, the job of these colonies were to provide wealth. But also, the British government looked at the colonies and wanted them to pay higher taxes to be able to defend them from the Spanish and the British. So this British mercantilism, the fact that they were being made to buy British goods and pay high taxes, really did not make sense to the colonists. Not only that, the colonists really were not represented in politics. In Parliament, there was nobody who was there to fight for the rights of the colonial citizens in the Americas. So the American colonists felt that the government in England did not represent them, did not represent their interests. Now, they felt that they were obligated to have this representation because they were British citizens. This combination of taxation and mercantilism without representation really began to split the American colonists from the British. When we look at nationalism, the Americans who lived in the colonies, they began to develop an identity that was different from being British. Living in the colonies was difficult. It required a great deal of self-sufficiency. It required a different demand than living in mainland Great Britain. And so the Americans began to think that they were different and separate from the British, having different goals, different ideas, and a different identity. Also, because of the use of joint stock companies, the colonists had become more politically independent. Each joint stock company was encouraged to develop a local government. Now, all in all, this separation between the Americans and the British in the 13 colonies began very much to drive them apart. And this idea that the colonists could not elect anybody to parliament, yet had to pay taxes, had to buy British, and could actually had their own, systems of government, really began to separate them. The British were unwilling to make these changes, and the Americans were unwilling to continue on with these. So, at Lexington and Concord, the rebellion started. The Americans began to fight back. But for the first year of the rebellion, the colonists were fighting for their rights as British citizens and not as an independent nation. Well, that changed in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was an expression of the colonial philosophy behind their right for independence. Using the ideas of John Locke, essentially, they argued that the British government was violating their rights and they had the right to change it and fight for their independence. As a result, the Americans won. The British walked away because of the expense and because they realized that the Americas were gone. Now, they did create a successful enlightened government, the American Republic, using the models of not only John Locke, but also Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire. But this was not fully enlightened. First of all, the rights of women were not respected, and feminism was not implemented till much later. And to make sure that the Americans remained unified, slavery was not addressed. Then we move to the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution was the most obvious revolution to start. France is ruled by an absolute government and had a social structure that ensured people were unequal. It was also the home in the Enlightenment. But the French Revolution is not going to be successful as the American Revolution. There's going to be a lot of issues that are going to cause problems, which really perpetuate the French Revolutions being plural. I think it's best described by this quote: "The French Revolution was the best of times because it pursued pure enlightened ideas. But it was the worst of times because of the number of people who died. It was the age of wisdom in that empiricism really replaced traditional thinking. But some of the things that they did were very foolish. So this is a revolution that shows pure belief in the Enlightenment, but also the misuse of the Enlightenment. So when we talk about the causes, we have to begin with French absolutism. This is the home of absolutism. This is where Louis XIV, the poster child for the absolute monarch, lived and left the system for his future rulers. In the 1780s, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were king and queen. And to be honest with you, both of them were horrible at governing. The king was more interested in tinkering with machines and being an engineer than actually being a ruler. And Marie Antoinette, well, she was raised to be a queen. So she didn't understand about, not spending money and not partying. This is going on while the French really are in big trouble. Their economy has just crashed because they lost the 7 Years' War. They essentially are behind on their bills. And essentially, the whole government is just not doing their job at all. So when you talk about another thing that the French Revolution kind of attacked, we have what's known as the ancient regime or the old regime. This is the old social structure in which the French population was divided into classes called estates. Each class had certain benefits and responsibilities. So when you begin with the clergy being the first estate or the highest social class, they made up probably, excuse me, a very small part of the population and did not pay any taxes. Same thing with the aristocracy, made up a very small amount of the population and didn't pay taxes, leaving the commoners, the middle class, all the way down to the peasants, to pay all the taxes and essentially have no benefits. Okay? So when you talk about the amount of wealth and the amount of population, okay, essentially the first estate was 0.5% of the population. The second estate is 1.5 of the population. And they owned in that 2% pretty much 90% of the money in France, leaving 98% of the population to divide that remaining 10% amongst themselves. To put it also, when you talk about land ownership, essentially the clergy and the nobility, the first and second estate, essentially owned not the most land, but the best land. So you can see that this ancient regime didn't make sense because it was based on birth. Now, the Enlightenment found a very, very surprising and very strong ally in the middle class, known as the bourgeoisie. And they are going to become the leadership of it. They're going to believe in the ideas of John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau in a body called classical liberalism. So far we've talked about the causes. We know that the Enlightenment attacked the French absolute system, it attacked French mercantilism, and it also attacked the ancient regime. So now we're moving to what triggered the revolution. We haven't gotten really to nationalism yet, but we'll get there in a second. France's economic problems and banks. As I've already established, the third estate paid pretty much 100% of the taxes. And France was in serious, serious debt. To give you an idea, when you look at the king's budget, the king, being the government, 50% of his budget paid for the interest on loans for fighting the American Revolution and the 7 Years' War. 25% of that budget went to feeding and clothing and arming the army. 25 went to taking care of Versailles. 10% went to his own coronation. Okay. 25% paid back principal of loans, and 25 went to his government, his bureaucracy. Well, if you can do math, you'll notice that that's 160%. That's 60% over their income. When you look at the people who paid taxes, essentially food was 80% of their taxes, rent was 25, tithing, giving taxes to the church was 10, and taxes to the government was 35, clothing was 20. Well, that too is 170%. So the financial problems are going to be triggering the French Revolution. On one hand, the government can't keep a balanced budget, and on the other hand, the commoners are suffering. The banks decide not to lend any more money to the government. So Louis calls the Estates General, the French Assembly, to try to solve this economic problem. Unfortunately, this organization had not met for about 125 years, And for the first month, instead of solving the economic problems, they argued about who sat where. When you look at the voting, voting was not done by person, it was done by estate. So 300 clergymen, priests, attended the Estates General, 300 aristocrats, and 648 commoners, yet each had one vote. So the commoners tried to get into the Estates General one day, but essentially found it closed for repairs. And so they went to a tennis court and decided that they were the true representatives of the nation. See, what's happening when you talk about nationalism, the third estate, being the commoners, the 98% of the population, feels that they are the true representation of the nation. They took the tennis court oath, and yes, it wasn't an indoor tennis court, and promised not to leave until they wrote a new enlightened constitution that was fair. So let's kind of walk through this again. Causes. We begin with the Enlightenment causes, attacking absolutism, and not just the fact that it really didn't represent the people, but also the government sucked. Mercantilism, which had caused the debt in the first place, and the unfair social structure called the old regime. Also, the Third Estate really embraced classical liberalism. As if you remember from chapter 5.1, that's the ideas of Locke and everybody combined. So when you talk about the trigger, the financial problems led to the development of nationalism in the Third Estate, who argued that they were truly the representatives of the French people in striving for liberty, equality, and fraternity, brotherhood. This is where nationalism comes in. So this is where I'm going to give you a little bit more information. So what I would do is I would put my pencil down right now and just kind of listen to this, and we'll come back to what to write down in just a second. But when you look at the French Revolution, it's not as cut and dried as the American Revolution. You begin with what's known as the liberal phase, then move to the radical phase, and you end it with the results called the Thermidorian reaction. Now, I will tell you specifically what you need to know and write down about these, but it's important that you understand this to be able to really get into the revolution. The first event of the French Revolution was the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was an ancient fortress used as a prison to imprison many people who believed in enlightened ideas and spoke out against the government. In this storming, 18 people died, 73 were wounded, 7 guards were killed, and all at an expense where it really just held 7 prisoners, 5 ordinary criminals and 2 madmen. But this was the first act of violence that really sees the French people step out and go directly against the king. The Third Estate goes on a rampage. They begin not only to purge the countryside of the First and Second Estate members, but also go through there and burn the papers and the contracts that tie them to the land. The Third Estate's getting pretty violent here. But the work of the National Assembly did lead to an enlightened change. So this is an important document. This is something you need to write down. This is the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And this was a statement that gave all men a set of rights that was greatly influenced by the Enlightenment. Now, there's some key things here. Okay? All men were equal, meaning that they had the right of speech, they had the right of religion, and things like that. But it did not apply to women, and it also did not give them the ability to vote. Voting was determined by the amount of wealth you had. This is why Olympe de Gouges, who we wrote before, wrote the Declaration of Woman and Citizen and began the fight for feminism. She was a woman who played a vital role in the revolution and essentially argued that women were equal to men. Unfortunately, she was put to death during the Reign of Terror. More on that later. What happens in France that did not happen in the Americas is the development of specific political ideas that are associated with groups. And this is one of the reasons why the French Revolution became so violent. We start off with the right, the conservatives, where we have those, usually upper class, who wanted to keep the absolute system and mercantilism. They were known as the Macharin. Then we have those who wanted a constitutional monarchy, the Girondins. And these are the people who are writing the new government. In the middle, we have the moderates, the swing votes, those who really don't ally themselves with one side. And as we get to the left, we see a group of people who want to go a little bit further. They're known as the Jacobins, and the Jacobins want a republic. So what happens is because of the continued issues, the Jacobins are going to take over. The Jacobins are a political club that essentially started as a debating society, but what happens is they spread their ideas of a true republic without a king through more and more people. And the failures of the National Assembly during the first phase of the revolution really made this group popular. So they're going to take over. They're going to institute their own republic, and they're going to begin the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is a time period where the enemies of the revolution, meaning the enemies of the Jacobins, are going to be put to death. And their leader was Maximilien Robespierre, who said terror is nothing than justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. And let terror be the order of the day. What he's trying to do is he's trying to eliminate those who oppose the French Republic through death. As you can see by my cool little meme there, you have the guillotines. So what happens is during this time period where we do have a republic, the court called the Revolutionary Tribunal of Paris executes 2,639 people in 15 months. Now, when you look at it from a national scale, this is 20,000. Part of the people executed was the king and Marie Antoinette. Now, this is important that you understand this. What's happening in the French Revolution is people can't agree on what the change should be. And in this phase of the revolution, those who wanted a republic are in power. Now, ultimately, when we talk about the results, we have to end with Napoleon. So let's kind of sum it up, the results. First off, the recovery of the Reign of Terror was Napoleon. Now, Napoleon was somewhat enlightened. He instituted schools. He gave people equal rights. But he was also a single leader who really controlled people's voice in government. It was not even a constitutional monarchy. Now, what this leads to is another series of revolutions. There's a French Revolution in the 1820s, in the 1830s, in the 1840s, and finally ending with the Revolution of 1868, where France truly embraced a full republic. So, just to summarize, what were the causes and the effects of the revolutions that I just talked about? This is where you check your chart. Okay, first of all, when you talk about the American Revolution, You're talking about essentially the Enlightenment criticized British mercantilism and the fact that the colonials did not have any representation in Parliament. And nationalism played a role in that the Americans had developed an identity separate from the British. The Declaration of Independence would be the key document, and the results was an enlightened republic, but a lacking in the areas of feminism and abolitionism. When you talk about the French Revolution, the Enlightenment attacked French absolutism, the Enlightenment attacked French mercantilism, and the ancient regime. But it also was triggered by the severe economic problems. So when you talk about the key document was the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. But when you look at the results, first off, the revolution became very violent through the Reign of Terror and ended up with Napoleon and future revolutions. So both of these focused on changing traditional political and economic and social processes, being mercantilism, the ancient regime, and absolutism. Both essentially had documents that were designed to promote individualism, people's rights, and self determination. And essentially, both eventually adopted an enlightened government, though the French, it took some time. The other thing that neither of these governments really did was provide for feminism nor provide for slavery.